The sun was sinking low over the wide plains when the rancher rode back from a long day of checking fences. His horse was weary, hooves heavy on the dusty trail, but the man's mind was heavier still. He had lived alone for years, his house a silent place echoing only with the wind. Life had hardened him, taken his family and left him with land and silence. He thought he had seen enough cruelty in the world to last a lifetime, but what he saw that evening broke something in him he hadn't even known still existed. At the edge of his property, near a cluster of mesquite trees, he caught sight of a strange shape swaying faintly in the breeze. His chest tightened as he urged his horse closer, dread building with every step. And then he saw her. A young Apache girl, her wrists tied above her head, her small frame hanging from a tree limb, the rope biting cruelly into her skin. Around her neck was a wooden sign crudely carved with the words, "White man don't forgive." Her head hung low, strands of dark hair hiding her face, and the man's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he sat frozen in the saddle. He had seen battles between settlers and natives, had witnessed the violence and the hatred, but this was something more personal. This wasn't war. This was vengeance, or perhaps some twisted warning. And yet, here she was, just a child, left to die as a message. The rancher dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the dry soil. He cut the ropes with his knife, catching her frail body as she slumped into his arms. She was barely breathing, her pulse faint against his calloused fingers. Her skin bore the marks of whipping and rope burns, her lips cracked from thirst. He carried her back to his horse and lifted her carefully onto the saddle, holding her against him as he rode home. The ride felt endless, every step of the horse echoing with the girl's labored breaths. The rancher spoke softly, words he hadn't spoken to anyone in years, telling her to hold on, telling her she wasn't alone. By the time he reached his cabin, the sky was painted with the deep hues of twilight. He brought her inside, laying her on his own bed. His hands shook as he fetched water, as if afraid she would vanish if he looked away. For days, he tended to her. He cleaned her wounds, spoon-fed her broth, and whispered comfort to a girl who could not answer. Sometimes she woke in a panic, eyes wide with fear, muttering words in Apache he couldn't understand. He would sit beside her, never moving, letting her see that he wasn't going to hurt her. Slowly, strength returned to her limbs, and color returned to her cheeks. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she finally met his gaze and whispered a single word, "Why?" The rancher didn't know how to answer. Why had someone done this to her? Why had he found her? Why did it stir something in him that had been long buried? He only shook his head, voice rough as he said, "Because no child deserves that." She stared at him, eyes dark and searching, as though trying to measure whether he spoke truth. As the weeks passed, she began to speak more. Her name was Nayeli. She had been taken by a group of men after a raid on her people. Some of her family was gone, some scattered. She had been beaten, mocked, and left to hang with that sign as a cruel warning. Yet in the silence of the rancher's cabin, she began to find fragments of peace. She learned his name, Caleb. She learned that his wife and son had died years before in a sickness that swept the land. He had buried them on the hill behind the cabin, and since then he had lived alone. At night, Caleb sometimes caught her staring at the graves through the window. Once, she asked him, "Do you hate my people?" He paused for a long time before answering, "I don't hate anyone. I've seen enough hate to know it only burns the one who carries it." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled faintly. Seasons shifted. The girl grew stronger, and the ranch no longer felt like a place of silence. He would come in from the fields to find her humming softly, weaving strands of grass or tending to the small garden. She began to laugh, though it was quiet, as though laughter was something foreign she was still learning. Caleb, too, felt something thaw within him, a warmth he thought had been buried with his family. Yet the sign that had hung around her neck haunted him. It was still out there, discarded in a corner of the barn. "White man don't forgive." It was more than just words, it was a reminder of the blood and bitterness that divided the land. Caleb knew there would be men who would not understand why he had taken her in. There would be danger if they found her under his roof. But when he looked at her, he knew he could never send her away. One evening, as the sky bled into a deep crimson, she stood beside him on the porch, watching the horizon. "They will come again," she said softly. "Not the same men, but others. Always." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then they'll have to face me first." She looked at him, studying the lines of his face, the hardness life had carved into him. Then she placed her small hand on his, and in that simple touch, he felt something break open inside him. The lonely rancher had found her hanging from a tree, marked as a symbol of hatred. But now, standing beside him, she was no longer just a victim. She was a living soul, a reminder that even in a land torn apart by vengeance, mercy could still be chosen. And though the world outside remained harsh and unforgiving, inside that small cabin, two broken lives began to heal in each other's presence. The ranch was quiet under the wide skies, the kind of quiet that stretched for miles, broken only by the wind slipping through the tall grasses and the distant cry of a hawk. Caleb had always thought of that silence as his companion, the only thing that stayed after everything else had been stripped away. But now the silence was shared, shaped by the soft movements of the girl who moved about his home, by the whispers of her voice when she prayed in her tongue at night, by the sound of her bare feet crossing the wooden floor. He had not asked for her presence, had not gone searching for it, and yet her being there filled something in the air he had never known was missing. Nayeli was cautious at first, as though each day she expected him to turn on her, to cast her back into the wilderness. Her eyes still carried the shadows of the tree where he had found her, still held that fear that the rope would tighten again if she trusted too much. Caleb never pressed her, never asked her to explain more than she was willing to say. He worked the land during the day and gave her space, only watching from the corner of his eye as she began to explore small tasks around the cabin. She would sweep the floor, gather kindling, tend the fire. Each act was careful, deliberate, as though she was proving to herself that this place would not reject her. The rancher had thought himself hardened, but he found himself softening without meaning to. There were moments when she would turn suddenly, a flicker of fear in her eyes, and his chest would ache in a way that surprised him. He wanted to take that fear away, to prove to her that the world could still offer safety. And yet, he knew he was just one man against a world that seemed determined to divide itself. One night a storm rolled over the plains, thunder growling deep in the clouds, lightning splitting the horizon. The rain came in sheets, lashing the windows and rattling the shutters. Nayeli sat near the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, eyes darting with every crack of thunder. Caleb saw her trembling and set down his cup. Without a word, he moved closer, sitting on the floor beside her. The firelight flickered over her face, over the scars on her wrists. Slowly, she shifted, leaning just slightly into his shoulder, her body rigid with the effort of trust. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just let her rest there as the storm raged outside. By the time the thunder rolled away, she had fallen asleep, her small frame against him, and Caleb realized he hadn't felt so needed since he had lost his own son. Days grew into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons rolled forward, each bringing its own labor and its own memory. Caleb taught her to ride, though at first she resisted, clinging to the ground as though it were safer than the back of a horse. But he was patient, lifting her into the saddle, walking beside her as the animal carried her in slow circles. She was silent the first few times, knuckles white on the reins, but then one day she laughed, a soft, startled sound, as the horse picked up speed. Caleb had turned at the sound, heart pounding, for that laugh was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She learned to plant alongside him, her small hands dark with soil as they set seeds into the earth. She asked questions about the tools, about the crops, about why he kept the land when it seemed to demand so much of him. He told her simply, "Because it's what I have left." She nodded at that, and in her eyes he thought he saw understanding deeper than her years. But it wasn't all ease. There were days when the shadows returned, when Nayeli withdrew into herself, staring out the window with a gaze that seemed to pierce the horizon. Once, Caleb heard her crying quietly in the night. He sat outside her door, back against the wall, not intruding but letting her know she wasn't alone. She didn't open the door, didn't ask him in, but the next morning she placed a small bundle of wildflowers on the table, her silent way of saying she had noticed his presence. The memory of the sign never left either of them. Caleb kept it tucked away in the barn, but there were times he caught Nayeli glancing toward that corner, her face tight with unspoken words. The message carved into that wood was a wound neither of them could ignore, because it was not just about her tormentors but about the world they lived in. It was a world where the line between white and native had been drawn in blood, and neither kindness nor mercy seemed strong enough to erase it. Caleb knew that taking her in had set him against that world, whether he wanted it or not. One afternoon, as the sun burned hot above the fields, Caleb spotted dust rising along the trail leading to his property. He shaded his eyes, heart thudding. Riders. As they drew closer, he saw 3 men, their clothes rough, guns strapped at their sides. Neighbors, if the word could be used for men who shared only the land and not the heart. They dismounted near his fence, eyes scanning the property. "Caleb," one called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Word is you've been harboring one of them." Caleb's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, his hand resting near his holster though he didn't draw. "Word travels faster than truth," he said evenly. The man spat into the dirt. "Don't play dumb. Folks seen her. Apache Girl. After all that's been done, after what they've taken from us, you think we're gonna sit quiet while you keep one under your roof?" Behind him, Caleb sensed Naeli watching from the window. He kept his gaze steady on the men. "She's a child," he said, voice low. "She's harmed no one." "That don't matter," the man snapped. Snakes. Still a snake, no matter how small. You best send her back where she came from before trouble finds you. Caleb's hand tightened on his belt. "She stays." The air grew taut, the silence heavy. One of the men sneered. "Suit yourself, but don't say you weren't warned. Folks don't forgive." With that, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. Caleb turned slowly, meeting Naeli's eyes through the window. She looked pale, her hands pressed to the glass. When he entered the cabin, she whispered, "They will come again." "Yes," he said. "And I'll be ready." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Why do you fight for me? You owe me nothing." Caleb sank into a chair, weary but resolute. "Because someone should have fought for you before. Because no one fought for my family when they needed it. Because I won't let hate decide what kind of man I am." Naeli stared at him, tears brimming in her eyes. Slowly, she crossed the room and laid her small hand over his. For the first time, she didn't look afraid. The days that followed were uneasy. Caleb worked with one eye always on the horizon, wary of riders, wary of shadows. Naeli helped him, but he could feel her fear lingering. Yet in the quiet of the evenings, they found small moments of peace, sharing meals, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, watching the stars emerge over the wide sky. Caleb told her stories of his wife, of his boy, of the way life had once been before sorrow hollowed it out. Naeli listened, and in turn, she began to share pieces of her own story, her mother's lullabies, the dances around the fire, the way the land smelled after rain in her village. In those exchanges, the rancher and the girl stitched together a fragile thread of family. Not the kind made by blood, but by survival, by choice, by the decision to stand against a world that demanded they remain enemies. And as the seasons turned once more, the ranch no longer felt like a place of silence. It felt like a home. The days stretched longer with the approach of summer, the kind of heat that pressed down on man and beast alike until every breath felt heavy. Caleb rose early, working while the air was still cool, then returned to the cabin for water before going out again. Naeli often followed, her small hands carrying what she could, tools, baskets, or simply her quiet company. He noticed she was growing taller, her face beginning to lose some of its childlike roundness, though her eyes still held the weight of more years than she had lived. The warning from the riders never left Caleb's mind. He knew men like that would not let go so easily, and he knew others would share their anger. His decision to shelter her was not just an act of mercy but a defiance, a refusal to bend to the hatred simmering around them. Some nights he lay awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of hooves or the creak of wood that would mean danger had arrived. But each morning he rose again, determined not to let fear dictate his choices. Naeli sensed his unease. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she asked, "Do you regret finding me?" The question struck him harder than he expected. He set down his cup, staring into the flames. "No," he said finally. "I regret what was done to you. But not you being here." She watched him carefully, as though weighing his honesty. Then she nodded, as if some invisible balance had been set straight. Weeks passed, and the bond between them deepened. Caleb taught her how to mend fences, how to care for the horses, how to aim with a rifle though he prayed she would never need to use it. She was quick to learn, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. She laughed more often now, and when she did, the cabin seemed warmer. For Caleb, the laughter was a reminder of what he thought he had buried with his wife and son. For Nayeli, it was proof that life could still carry moments of joy even after cruelty. But the shadow of the outside world loomed ever near. One late afternoon, while Caleb was repairing a section of fence, Nayeli came running across the field, her breath ragged, eyes wide with alarm. "Riders," she panted. "Many." Caleb stood, the hammer slipping from his hand. In the distance, he saw them, 6 men this time, dust rising in their wake. They carried rifles across their saddles, and even from afar, Caleb could feel the hostility rolling off them. He led Nayeli quickly back to the cabin. "Stay inside," he told her firmly. "No matter what happens, don't come out." She clutched his arm, shaking her head. "They will kill you. I've lived long enough to know the risk," he said softly. "But I won't let them take you." She stared at him, trembling, then finally obeyed, slipping into the cabin as he stepped onto the porch. The riders halted before the gate, their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, calling out, "Caleb, you're making a mistake." Caleb's voice was steady. "That girl is under my protection. You'll not take her." The man sneered. "You think you can stand against all of us for the sake of some savage brat? She ain't worth your blood." "She's worth more than your hate," Caleb shot back. His hand rested near his revolver, though he hadn't drawn it. The tension was thick, the kind that made the air hum with violence waiting to burst. One of the riders spat into the dirt. "Last chance, old man. Hand her over." Caleb's voice was iron. "No." For a moment, it seemed the standoff would ignite into gunfire. But then the leader narrowed his eyes, smirked, and pulled on his reins. "We'll be back," he promised. "And next time, you won't be standin'." They turned and rode off, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Caleb stood rooted on the porch, his chest tight, sweat rolling down his back. When he finally entered the cabin, Nayeli was waiting, her face pale. She threw her arms around him before he could speak. "They'll come again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes," he admitted, holding her tightly. "But we'll be ready." The days that followed were filled with preparation. Caleb fortified the cabin, reinforced the doors, checked his weapons. He taught Nayeli more about shooting, though it pained him to place a gun in her hands. She practiced with determination, her jaw set, her eyes fierce. She no longer looked like the frightened child he had found hanging from that tree. She was becoming something stronger, forged by pain and survival. Still, fear lingered. Some nights Caleb saw her wake from nightmares, her body trembling, her eyes wet with tears. He would sit with her until the fear passed, speaking softly of the stars, of the promise of morning. Once, she looked at him and whispered, "You're like my father now." The words lodged in his chest, heavy and tender all at once. The attack came sooner than he expected. It was dawn, the sky barely touched with light, when the sound of hooves shattered the morning calm. Caleb was already awake, sensing something wrong. He shook Nayeli from her sleep. "They're here." Her eyes widened, but she didn't falter. She grabbed the rifle, her hands steady. Caleb took position by the window, heart pounding. Through the dust he counted 8 riders this time, their guns glinting in the early light. The men didn't waste time with threats. They opened fire, bullets shattering wood, splintering the cabin walls. Caleb fired back, each shot deliberate, forcing them to scatter. Nayeli crouched beside him, her rifle ready. "Stay low," he told her. The gunfire roared, echoing across the plains. Caleb felt the burn of a bullet graze his arm, but he kept shooting, determined to hold them off. Through the chaos, he saw Nayeli take aim, her face pale but resolute. She squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against her shoulder. One of the riders cried out, toppling from his horse. Caleb's breath caught, pride and sorrow mingling in him. She had defended herself, defended their home. But toppling from his horse. Caleb's breath caught, pride and sorrow mingling in him. She had defended herself, defended their home. But she was still so young, too young to bear such weight. The fight dragged on, the air thick with smoke and dust. At last, the attackers retreated, leaving behind 2 of their own lying still in the dirt. The others fled, shouting curses, vowing revenge. Silence settled heavy after they were gone, broken only by the ragged sound of Caleb's breathing. He turned to Nayeli. She was shaking now, the rifle slipping from her hands. He caught her, pulling her close. "It's over," he murmured. "For now, it's over." She buried her face against him, sobs racking her small frame. He held her, his own eyes burning. The battle had been won, but the war with hate was far from finished. In the days that followed, Caleb buried the bodies on the edge of his land, marking the graves with simple stones. He did it not out of respect for them but because he refused to leave anyone to the animals. Nayeli watched silently, her eyes unreadable. When it was done, she asked, "Will they come again?" "Yes," he said honestly. "Hate always comes again." She nodded slowly, then lifted her chin. "Then we will face it." Her words struck him. She no longer sounded like the broken child he had found. She was growing into someone who carried her pain not as chains but as armor. Time moved forward, as it always does. Caleb and Nayeli rebuilt the damage to the cabin, their bond deepening with every shared labor, every quiet evening. She began to sing sometimes, soft songs in her language, filling the cabin with melodies that seemed older than the land itself. Caleb would sit and listen, closing his eyes, letting the music wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. And yet, the sign in the barn remained, its words carved deep, "White man don't forgive." It was a reminder of the gulf between them and the world outside, a reminder of the cruelty that had nearly destroyed her. One afternoon, Caleb found Nayeli holding it, her fingers tracing the letters. "Do you believe this?" she asked quietly. Caleb shook his head. "I believe forgiveness is the only thing that saves a man. But not everyone sees it that way." She looked at him, her dark eyes solemn. "Do you forgive?" He paused, the question sinking deep. He thought of the men who had killed his family, of the sickness that had taken them, of the hatred that burned through the land. At last he said, "I try. Some days I fail. But I keep trying." Nayeli was silent, then gently set the sign into the fire. They watched as the flames consumed it, the words curling into ash. Neither spoke, but in that moment, something heavy lifted between them. Years later, the story of the lonely rancher and the Apache girl would spread in whispers, some calling him a fool, others calling him a traitor, and still others calling him a man who dared to stand against hate. But for Caleb and Nayeli, it wasn't about what the world thought. It was about survival, about healing, about building a life together out of the ruins of cruelty. On the hill behind the cabin, where Caleb's wife and son rested, 2 more graves would eventually be dug, one for him, one for her when her time came. And perhaps the wind that swept across the plains would carry the sound of her songs, the songs of a girl who had once been left to die with a sign around her neck, and of a man who chose mercy instead of hate. Together, they carved out a home where there had once been only silence, proving that even in a world of unforgiving hearts, compassion could endure.